He refused love until he saw her broken heart. What happened next will shock you. Michael had always believed that love was more trouble than it was worth. At 32, he had built a life that many would envy, a well-paying corporate job in Chicago, a modern apartment overlooking the skyline, and a small circle of friends who shared his dry sense of humor and love for quiet weekends. On the surface, his life looked perfect. But beneath it all, Michael carried a wall he had built over the years. That wall was built from disappointments, betrayals, and the simple fear of being hurt again. Love, he often reminded himself, only led to weakness. He lived by a strict routine. Weekdays were consumed with meetings, reports, and strategy sessions. Evenings were spent either at the gym or reading in his apartment, accompanied by a cup of coffee and the city lights through his window. Weekends, when he was not traveling for work, were quiet and controlled, a time to recharge, not a time for emotional risk. People often called him cold or distant, but he didn't mind. It was easier than explaining why he couldn't trust his heart. That was until the day he met Emma. Emma was not the type to stand out in a crowd in the way a model or celebrity might. She did not have an imposing presence, nor did she demand attention. What made her remarkable was something quieter, a warmth, a light in her eyes, and a kindness in her smile that drew people in without effort. Michael first noticed her at the shelter where he had volunteered on a corporate social responsibility initiative. His company often encouraged employees to participate in charitable events, and though he usually attended reluctantly, today he had committed himself to the activity. Emma was directing a small group of volunteers, organizing food and clothing donations for families in need. She moved with purpose, her laughter mingling with the soft hum of conversations around her. Michael found himself watching her from across the room, noting how she greeted everyone with genuine attention, not just polite words. There was a subtle grace in the way she listened to each person, nodding with empathy, asking thoughtful questions. It was the kind of presence that made people feel seen, and Michael, who had spent much of his life hiding his emotions, felt a tug at something deep inside him. When their eyes met for the first time, he looked away quickly, a rare flush of self-consciousness rising in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling nervous around someone he didn't need to impress professionally. Yet Emma smiled gently, as if acknowledging the fleeting connection, and returned to her work. Michael told himself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, easily forgotten. He busied himself with sorting boxes and checking lists, focusing on the mundane tasks, but he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. Over the next few weeks, Michael found himself encountering Emma more often, both at the shelter and in casual, coincidental ways. She seemed to be everywhere, not in a stalkerish way, but in a manner that made the world feel smaller and unexpectedly familiar. At the shelter, she would offer to explain tasks patiently, never making anyone feel inadequate. Michael, who had always been used to controlling his surroundings, found himself quietly observing her interactions. He noted how she remembered names, how she remembered details about people's lives, how she laughed at small jokes not because they were funny, but because she genuinely enjoyed the company around her. Despite these observations, Michael kept his distance. He smiled politely, engaged in small talk, and offered help where needed, but he never lingered. Emma, sensing his reserve, did not push. She treated him the same as anyone else, with kindness and respect, yet her warmth was a subtle invitation that he consistently ignored. Part of him admired her strength, the way she moved through the world without pretension or fear, but another part, the part that had been burned before, told him to stay away. It wasn't just fear of heartbreak that held him back. Michael had grown comfortable with solitude. He had learned to find satisfaction in his own company, in the predictable rhythms of work and life. Love, he feared, would shatter that equilibrium. It would demand openness, vulnerability, and trust, all things he had spent years convincing himself were unnecessary. The thought of losing control, of letting someone in, made him tense, even anxious. And so he kept his distance, rationalizing his coldness as self-preservation. Emma, however, was persistent in the quietest of ways. She didn't chase him, didn't flirt or manipulate. She simply existed in the same spaces, radiating patience and goodwill. She shared stories of her art, of the struggles and triumphs of the families at the shelter, and of her own life growing up in a small town before moving to Chicago. Michael listened, occasionally contributing but always keeping an emotional wall between them. He told himself he was being prudent, logical, and responsible. He was not ready for love, and he never would be, not fully, not willingly. Yet there were moments when that wall felt fragile. A laugh shared over a silly misunderstanding, a glance that lasted a little too long, a quiet smile when she caught him staring. Each of these moments chipped away at the defenses he had so carefully constructed. Michael found himself thinking about her long after their encounters ended, replaying conversations in his head, wondering if she truly noticed his subtle gestures. He hated how much he cared, and yet he could not deny it. Friends began to notice subtle changes in him. James, his closest friend since college, teased him lightly. "You smile too much when you're with that girl," he said one evening over dinner. Michael's usual response was a dry remark or a shrug, but inside he felt a mix of irritation and disbelief. He didn't want to admit that Emma had affected him, that she had made his carefully compartmentalized world feel unpredictable and full of possibilities. One Saturday, the shelter held a small art exhibition to raise awareness and funds. Emma had organized it, showcasing her own paintings alongside works by local children. Michael had attended out of obligation at first, but as he walked through the gallery, he felt something shift. Watching Emma interact with the children, encouraging them, celebrating their creativity, he realized how deeply he had underestimated her. She was not just kind or talented, she was remarkable in a way that demanded recognition. During that event, a child accidentally spilled a tray of paints, and Emma immediately knelt to help them clean it up, laughing at the mess with unrestrained joy. Michael watched, caught between admiration and a pang of longing he could not name. In that moment, he felt the first real stirrings of something he had long denied, the possibility of love, not as a distraction, but as a force that could enrich his life. But even as he felt this stir, he reminded himself of his rules. Love was dangerous. Emotional attachment was unnecessary. He could admire from a distance, care quietly, but he could never give in. And so he left the gallery that evening with a polite goodbye, ignoring the small ache in his chest, convincing himself that tomorrow everything would be the same as always. Yet deep down, Michael knew that things had changed. For the first time in years, the predictable patterns of his life were being challenged, and he felt an unfamiliar tension between caution and desire. He did not yet understand the full impact Emma would have on him, or how her presence would gradually force him to confront the walls he had built around his heart. It was the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted, one that would test patience, resilience, and the very nature of love itself. And though Michael refused to acknowledge it, a quiet, unspoken truth was taking root. Some hearts, no matter how guarded, are meant to be touched. Even as Michael tried to convince himself that nothing had changed, he found it increasingly difficult to ignore Emma. Her presence lingered in the corners of his mind long after the shelter visits ended. It wasn't just her smile, her laughter, or the warmth she extended to everyone. It was something subtler, something that made the air feel lighter whenever she was near. He started noticing the way his thoughts wandered toward her during meetings, how he replayed her small gestures in his head late at night, or how he found himself hoping, almost unconsciously, that their paths would cross again. Yet, he remained cautious. Michael had built his life on careful planning, on control and predictability. Love was messy, unpredictable, and vulnerable, and he was not willing to risk the stability he had worked so hard to achieve. He maintained his polite distance, engaging with Emma when necessary, sharing the occasional laugh, but never venturing into territory that might expose his heart. Every small connection, every quiet smile was followed by a rationalization. "I am being kind, nothing more." Emma, however, had begun to sense that there was more to Michael than his walls suggested. She noticed the way he paused before answering her questions, the way his eyes lingered a fraction longer than necessary, the way his hands twitched when he laughed. She didn't push him, and she never forced a conversation about feelings, but she subtly sought moments to be near him. Whether it was offering him a cup of coffee at the shelter or asking for his opinion on an upcoming event, she created small opportunities for interaction, leaving him with choices that were increasingly hard to ignore. It was during one of these ordinary days that Michael first felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest. The shelter was hosting a small fundraising event, and he had volunteered again, though reluctantly. Emma had organized a series of art activities for the children and decorations for the room. Michael found himself helping quietly, but his attention kept drifting to her. He watched as she explained painting techniques to the children, kneeling to their level, her voice gentle and encouraging. She didn't just instruct, she connected, laughed, and inspired. A little boy accidentally knocked over a paint jar, and the bright blue liquid spilled across the table. Michael expected Emma to react sharply, to scold him or show irritation. Instead, she laughed softly and said, "It's okay, mistakes are part of learning. Let's clean it together." She grabbed a cloth, and Michael found himself standing beside her, wiping the mess. Their hands brushed briefly, and he felt an unexpected spark, a jolt that he immediately tried to suppress. "You're patient with them?" he said, trying to sound casual, though his voice carried more warmth than he intended. Emma looked at him, her smile gentle. "Patience is a small price to pay when someone's learning. Everyone deserves that." It was such a simple statement, but Michael felt it resonate deeply. He wanted to argue, to dismiss the feeling it stirred inside him, but he could not. He left the shelter that evening with a strange heaviness, a mixture of admiration, longing, and confusion. He hated that he cared, yet he couldn't deny it. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Emma would ask him about his weekends, about small things in his life, and though he was cautious, he found himself sharing bits of himself, stories about childhood, fleeting memories from college, or even thoughts about the mundane aspects of work. Each revelation was tiny, almost insignificant, but it chipped away at the wall he had built around his emotions. Michael realized, often with surprise, that he looked forward to these conversations. One afternoon, they found themselves sitting together in a quiet corner of a cafe near the shelter. Emma had suggested it after a long day of organizing supplies. Michael usually preferred silence when he was outside work, but something about her presence made it comfortable to talk. They spoke about books, movies, and even childhood dreams. Emma shared stories about her art classes, the first time she had exhibited her paintings, and the small victories that had shaped her career. Michael listened intently, noticing how animated her hands became when she spoke passionately. "You really care about what you do," he said quietly, unable to hide his admiration. Emma tilted her head, meeting his gaze. "I think it's important to care. Life is short, and we have to put our hearts into something meaningful." Her words lingered with him long after the cafe visit ended. He realized that caring, truly caring, was something he had avoided for so long. He had focused on control, predictability, and self-protection, but Emma reminded him that life without connection was incomplete. Despite his growing feelings, Michael continued to resist. Every time he imagined being close to Emma, he felt the familiar tug of fear. What if he allowed himself to care, only to be hurt again? What if opening his heart led to disappointment or rejection? So he maintained his distance, offering kindness but never allowing intimacy. Meanwhile, Emma began to notice Michael's hesitations. She saw the way he would hesitate before speaking about personal matters, the careful neutrality in his tone, the small pauses that betrayed inner conflict. But she didn't push. Emma believed that trust had to be earned, that forcing someone to confront their feelings before they were ready would only drive them away. Instead, she continued to create gentle opportunities for connection, waiting patiently for Michael to come to his own realization. One rainy evening, Michael found himself walking past a local park where he had seen Emma volunteering children's art activities in the past. He hesitated at the edge of the park, the sound of rain tapping against the pavement and the smell of wet earth filling the air. He thought of her laughter, the light in her eyes, and the ease with which she connected with others. He realized, with a mix of fear and longing, that he wanted to be near her, but old habits die hard. Michael turned away, convincing himself that it was better to remain distant. Love, after all, was unpredictable. The risk of heartbreak was too great, and yet he couldn't escape the feeling that something was shifting inside him, a quiet, persistent tug at his heart that refused to be ignored. The weeks passed, and their interactions continued. Small gestures, a smile, a shared joke, a brief conversation began to accumulate into a subtle tension. Michael noticed how he thought about Emma during his daily routines, how he replayed her words in his mind, and how he found himself imagining scenarios where he might allow himself to be vulnerable. He hated the feeling, yet it was undeniable. One evening, while organizing supplies at the shelter, Michael noticed Emma struggling to reach a high shelf. Without thinking, he stepped forward and lifted the box for her. Their hands touched briefly, and she looked at him with a warm smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice betraying a hint of emotion he immediately tried to suppress. It was a simple act, but it held a weight that neither of them could ignore. Michael realized that the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crumble, not because of grand gestures or dramatic moments, but because of the steady, persistent presence of someone who genuinely cared. As days turned into weeks, Michael found himself confronting feelings he had long denied. He began to notice the small details, the way Emma's hair fell across her face when she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke passionately about her art, the way she treated everyone with respect and kindness. Each observation chipped away at his resolve, forcing him to acknowledge that he was capable of caring deeply. Yet, fear remained. Michael continued to resist fully, convincing himself that he was protecting both of them. He admired her from a distance, engaged when necessary, and kept his emotions carefully guarded. It was a delicate balance, one that left him feeling both frustrated and alive in a way he had not experienced in years. Then came a quiet moment that neither of them would forget. During a particularly busy day at the shelter, a child approached Michael with a drawing they had made. It was a simple sketch, but it showed a figure standing next to someone who looked remarkably like Emma. The child said, "This is you and Emma helping everyone." Michael looked at the drawing, his chest tightening. The innocence of the gesture, combined with the admiration reflected in the child's eyes, forced him to confront the truth he had long denied. He cared for Emma more than he was willing to admit. He left the shelter that evening feeling conflicted. The wall around his heart had been breached, and he could no longer pretend that he was indifferent. Emma had done nothing more than be herself, kind, patient, genuine, and yet she had awakened something inside him that he could not control. It was the beginning of a slow transformation. Michael realized that he could no longer maintain the rigid boundaries he had erected around his life. Love, he understood, was not a weakness. It was a choice, a risk, and a possibility. Emma had shown him, in quiet and consistent ways, that caring deeply for someone could be beautiful rather than painful. And so, as he walked home that night through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, Michael felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. He did not yet know how he would navigate these feelings, or whether he would be brave enough to act on them. But one thing was certain: his life, once predictable and controlled, had shifted irrevocably. The presence of Emma, her kindness, her light, had forced him to confront a truth he had long denied: that love, despite its risks, was worth considering. Michael had tried for weeks to keep his emotions in check. Every day, he reminded himself that getting close to Emma would only lead to complications he was not prepared to handle. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, her presence lingered in his thoughts like a quiet echo he could not ignore. Her laughter, her kindness, the way she listened with full attention, it all haunted him during late nights when the apartment felt too quiet, when the city lights blurred against the rain-streaked windows. Emma, meanwhile, had been unaware of the internal struggle Michael faced. She continued to treat him with her characteristic warmth, sharing her small victories, her moments of frustration, and her dreams for the future. She never pressed him about his feelings, though sometimes, in fleeting glances or soft smiles, she hinted at a hope that he would allow himself to be more than a distant friend. Michael, for his part, participated in these conversations, offering polite smiles, occasional comments, and gentle laughter, but he never allowed himself to let her in completely. It was during one late autumn evening that everything began to change. The shelter was hosting a small fundraising gala to raise money for children's art programs, and volunteers were bustling about, arranging decorations, preparing food, and setting up the exhibition space. Michael had agreed to attend, mostly out of habit and the insistence of his colleagues. He had intended to remain on the sidelines, perform his duties, and leave without drawing attention. Emma, as always, was radiant in her energy. She moved from table to table, encouraging volunteers, sharing stories about the children, and keeping the atmosphere light and joyful. Michael noticed her glow, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed at a child's joke, and felt a pang of longing he could not define. He wanted to speak, to share something personal, but the fear that had kept him distant for so long loomed large. As the evening progressed, a young girl approached Emma, holding a small bundle of drawings she had made. The child's hands trembled slightly, but Emma took the drawings gently, praising the effort and creativity. Michael watched, standing a few feet away, as Emma knelt to the child's level, her voice soft and full of encouragement. It was a scene so tender, so full of genuine care, that Michael's chest tightened. He felt a strange mixture of admiration, longing, and guilt, because he had never allowed himself to express how he truly felt about her. After the interaction, Emma turned and caught Michael watching her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she smiled, a small, knowing smile that made his heart skip. He looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the intensity of the connection. That evening, as the gala continued, Michael busied himself with menial tasks, hoping to escape the emotions swirling within him. But try as he might, he could not forget the way Emma's eyes had held his, the warmth of her smile, the quiet strength in her presence. The turning point came later that night during the final part of the event. Volunteers were cleaning up, organizing supplies, and saying their goodbyes. Michael and Emma were alone in a quiet corner, folding colorful flyers and stacking chairs. She looked at him, her expression gentle but serious. "You've been different lately," she said softly. "More present. I can see you paying attention, noticing things you used to ignore." Michael hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wanted to explain, to confess the conflict raging inside him, but words failed him. Instead, he offered a small, awkward smile. I guess I just notice things now," he said quietly, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed a hint of vulnerability. Emma tilted her head slightly, her gaze searching his face. She didn't push for more, but her silence spoke volumes. Michael felt exposed, the walls he had built around his heart beginning to tremble. Later that night, after the gala had ended, Michael walked home through the crisp autumn air, reflecting on the evening. He realized he had been suppressing his feelings for too long, that the fear of vulnerability had prevented him from experiencing something truly meaningful. Emma had touched a part of him he had long ignored, the part that still yearned for connection, for love, for trust. But just as he was beginning to accept these emotions, a thought struck him that chilled him to the bone. What if he had waited too long? What if Emma, sensing his hesitation, had begun to lose hope? The possibility of losing her, of watching her heartache, filled him with a dread he had never experienced before. The next few days were torturous for Michael. He found himself obsessing over small interactions, replaying moments in his head, and analyzing every glance, every word, every gesture. His friends noticed his distracted behavior, commenting on how quiet and preoccupied he had become. Michael brushed them off, insisting he was fine, but inside, he was consumed by the realization that he might have let the most important person in his life slip away. Emma, meanwhile, had begun to sense a change in Michael. She noticed how he lingered during conversations, how his eyes followed her when she moved through the room, and how his smiles seemed more genuine, more vulnerable. She did not push, but she remained patient, understanding that trust and emotional openness could not be forced. Her heart, however, carried a quiet tension, a hope that he would finally allow himself to be present, and a fear that he might not. Then came the day that would alter everything. Michael had arranged to meet Emma at the shelter to help with a special project. He arrived early, rehearsing in his mind the words he wanted to say, the confession he wanted to make. But when he walked in, he found Emma sitting quietly, tears streaming down her face, clutching a small note in her hands. Michael froze, the sight of her brokenness hitting him like a physical blow. The note, which she had written but never sent, expressed her feelings, the love, the hope, the longing, and ultimately, the pain of unrequited affection. She had waited patiently, had given him countless opportunities, and yet he had refused to step beyond his walls. Seeing her like this, Michael felt a surge of guilt and sorrow unlike anything he had ever known. He had always feared vulnerability, but now he understood the consequences of his caution. The very walls he had built to protect himself had caused real pain to someone he deeply cared for. Emma looked up, her eyes red and puffy, and Michael saw the depth of her hurt. She did not speak at first, and he found himself unable to find words that could repair the damage. All he could do was stand there, helpless and full of regret. Finally, she whispered, "I waited, Michael. I believed in you. I trusted you. But you refused me." The words cut deeper than any criticism he had ever received. Michael's mind raced, searching for a way to explain, to apologize, to make things right. But he realized that no explanation could undo the pain he had caused. His fear of vulnerability had led him to reject the very thing that could have brought him true happiness. He took a tentative step forward, his voice trembling. "Emma, I didn't realize. I thought I was protecting myself, but I see now I was protecting nothing but my fear. I never wanted to hurt you." Emma's gaze softened slightly, but the hurt was still evident. "It's too late for excuses, Michael. I needed you to see me, to trust me, to be willing to care. And you weren't ready." Michael nodded, the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he could not undo the past, but he could try to make amends, to show that his feelings were real, and that he was finally ready to confront the walls he had built. Over the next few days, Michael did everything he could to demonstrate his sincerity. He showed up without expectation, listened without judgment, and allowed himself to be present in ways he had never done before. He offered help not as a duty, but as an act of genuine care. He expressed his admiration for Emma's work, her patience, her kindness, and slowly, cautiously began to rebuild the bridge he had once refused to cross. Emma, cautious but hopeful, responded in kind. She did not rush into forgiveness or renewed trust, but she allowed him small gestures of connection. A shared laugh, a quiet conversation, a simple act of kindness. Each moment was a step toward healing. Michael realized that love, unlike fear, required patience, humility, and consistent effort. It could not be demanded, only earned. By the time a few weeks had passed, the air between them had shifted. There was a subtle warmth, a quiet understanding, and a tentative trust that neither had experienced before. Michael knew that he could never take Emma's heart for granted again, and Emma understood that true forgiveness required acknowledgement of past mistakes. Together, they began the slow, delicate process of building a bond that was stronger and more authentic than either could have imagined. Michael had once refused love, convinced it was a weakness. Now, standing beside Emma, witnessing her resilience and her unwavering heart, he realized that love was not a weakness at all. It was the most courageous act a person could undertake, to trust, to care, to open one's heart despite the risk of pain. And as he looked at Emma, smiling gently, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Hope that love, when chosen with honesty and patience, could heal, transform, and endure. Michael knew that words alone could not undo the weeks, months, or perhaps even years of emotional distance he had placed between himself and Emma. He had seen the hurt in her eyes, felt the weight of the trust he had broken, and understood that repairing what had been damaged would require more than apologies. It would take time, patience, and genuine action. And yet, as he stood outside the shelter one quiet morning, watching her interact with the children as if nothing had happened, he realized he was willing to do whatever it took. Emma, for her part, had begun to rebuild herself after the heartbreak. She had cried, journaled, and taken long walks in the city to reflect on what had happened. Her friends had supported her, offering comfort and perspective, but she carried a quiet fear, the fear that someone she cared about deeply might never be able to meet her halfway. She had learned that trust was not a given, that love required courage on both sides, and that sometimes patience was the only way forward. The first step came one afternoon when Michael arrived at the shelter unannounced, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked along the riverbank. Emma was arranging supplies for an upcoming art workshop when he approached. For a moment she froze, unsure whether to smile or maintain a cautious distance. Michael extended the flowers with a nervous smile. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said softly, "but I want to start making things right. I want to be present fully and honestly. Not just in words, but in actions." Emma studied him carefully. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability that had been absent before. Slowly, she accepted the flowers, her fingers brushing against his briefly. That small touch, innocent yet significant, felt like the first bridge between two hearts that had been apart for too long. In the weeks that followed, Michael dedicated himself to showing Emma his commitment. He volunteered at the shelter more consistently, not because it was required, but because he wanted to share her world, to understand her passions and struggles. He asked questions, listened attentively, and began to notice the small details that had once escaped him. The way Emma paused before responding to a child's question, the quiet gestures of encouragement she offered to volunteers, the way her laughter could brighten even most stressful moments. Each act of attention, each effort to engage genuinely, was a step toward rebuilding trust. Michael learned that love was not about grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was about presence, consistency, and humility. He had spent so long avoiding emotional risk that even the simplest acts of care required conscious effort. But for the first time in years, he felt alive in a way that was not tied to work or routine. He felt connected, seen, and vulnerable in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Emma, cautious but open, began to respond. She allowed Michael to accompany her on small projects, to help organize workshops, and to participate in her artistic pursuits. She noticed his dedication, his willingness to put aside pride, and the genuine care he offered not just to her, but to the children and volunteers around them. Slowly, she began to believe that he could change, that he could move beyond fear and embrace vulnerability. The real turning point came one rainy evening when the shelter hosted a community event. Volunteers and local families gathered to celebrate the children's artwork, share stories, and enjoy music and food. Michael had arrived early, helping to set up tables and decorations, while Emma coordinated the children's activities. During a quiet moment, a child approached them with a handmade card, a simple gesture of appreciation for the people who cared so much. Emma knelt to the child's level, thanking them with warmth, and Michael watched, noticing how her face lit up in joy. For the first time, Michael allowed himself to express what he had been feeling for months. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've spent so long avoiding this, avoiding you, avoiding feelings I didn't know how to handle. But I can't do it anymore. I care about you deeply. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me." Emma paused, studying him carefully. She could see the truth in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice, and the courage it had taken to speak. "Michael," she said softly, "it's not about the words, it's about the actions, and I can see you've been trying. But trust has to be earned, not demanded." Over the next few months, Michael continued to prove himself through consistent, thoughtful actions. He helped organize workshops, volunteered without expectation, and remained patient even when progress was slow. Emma responded in kind, opening herself to moments of connection, laughter, and shared experiences. Slowly, the fear and pain that had once separated them began to dissolve, replaced by a bond built on mutual respect, understanding, and care. They began to spend time together outside the shelter as well. Walks along the river, quiet afternoons at art galleries, and evenings sharing books and music allowed them to know each other more deeply. Michael learned about Emma's childhood dreams, her struggles with self-doubt, and her enduring hope despite setbacks. Emma discovered Michael's fears, his past disappointments, and the ways he had built walls to protect himself. Through these conversations, they learned not only to appreciate each other's strengths, but also to respect the vulnerabilities they revealed. One crisp winter evening, Michael and Emma found themselves sitting on a bench overlooking the frozen river. The city lights reflected on the icy surface, creating a quiet, magical glow. They talked about their hopes, fears, and the journey that had brought them together. For Michael, it was a moment of realization. He understood that love was not about avoiding pain, but about embracing it with courage, patience, and trust. "I never thought I'd be able to open my heart again," Michael admitted softly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I was so afraid of being hurt that I refused to let myself feel anything, but being with you, I understand now that love is worth the risk." Emma smiled gently, placing her hand over his. "It's not easy. It requires trust, patience, and courage. But I believe it can be beautiful if we're willing to try together." That night marked a turning point. Their relationship was no longer defined by hesitation or fear, but by conscious choice, effort, and mutual respect. Michael had learned that love required not only vulnerability, but also consistent action, showing up, listening, caring, and valuing the other person's heart. Emma had learned that trust could be rebuilt when met with sincerity and humility. As winter turned to spring, their bond deepened. They celebrated small victories together, a successful art workshop, a child's achievement, a shared laugh over a clumsy mishap. They faced challenges as a team, learning to communicate openly, resolve conflicts, and support each other's dreams. Michael discovered the joy of giving without expectation. the happiness that came from seeing Emma's eyes light up with accomplishment, and the profound satisfaction of being a steady presence in her life. Emma, in turn, discovered that Michael's love was genuine, that his actions matched his words, and that he was capable of deep emotional connection. She appreciated his patience, his thoughtfulness, and the way he had confronted his own fears to be fully present. Together, they built a relationship grounded in trust, empathy, and shared values. The story that had begun with hesitation, fear, and heartbreak now blossomed into something enduring. Michael had once refused love, convinced it was dangerous, unnecessary, or too vulnerable. Emma had waited, hoping he would one day recognize what was right in front of him. And through patience, persistence, and genuine effort, they found each other not in a moment of impulsive passion, but in the steady, deliberate unfolding of trust and care. One late afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through a park blooming with spring flowers, Michael stopped and looked at Emma, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and admiration. "I never want to take this for granted," he said softly. "You've taught me that love is about showing up every day, even when it's hard, and I want to do that for you with you always." Emma smiled, squeezing his hand. "And I want the same. We've both learned so much, and I believe that together we can face whatever comes next." They walked on, side by side, through the quiet streets of Chicago, feeling a sense of calm and hope that neither had known before. Their journey had been long, filled with hesitation, heartbreak, and self-discovery, but the reward was undeniable, a love forged not in haste or convenience, but in courage, patience, and understanding. In the end, Michael realized that refusing love had been a choice born of fear, but embracing it had become a decision born of strength. Emma understood that patience and trust could heal even the deepest wounds. Together, they had discovered that love, when nurtured with care and sincerity, could endure, transform, and inspire. And as they walked into the glow of the setting sun, hand in hand, both knew that their story was only beginning. A story built on real connection, shared growth, and a love that had survived the tests of time, fear, and heartbreak.